These are the extensors muscles of the forearm. They are arranged into a superficial and a deep group. The superficial group, in general, arises from the common extensor origin from the front of the lateral epicondyle. They begin laterally by the brachioradialis muscle, which arises from the upper two-thirds of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus. This muscle lies lateral to the brachialis muscle with the radial nerve in between. It forms the lateral boundary of the cubital fossa and covers both the radial nerve and radial artery in the forearm. It is inserted into the lateral aspect of the lower end of the radius. The brachioradialis overlaps the two radial extensors of the wrist. The extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. The extensor carpi radialis longus arises from the lower third of the lateral supracondylar ridge, while the extensor carpi radialis brevis arises lower down from the common extensor origin from the lateral epicondyle. The longus muscle is superficial to the brevis, and both muscles are crossed below by the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. The extensor carpi radialis longus is inserted into the back of the base of the second metacarpal, while the extensor carpi radialis brevis is inserted into the back of the base of the third metacarpal. The two muscles, longus and brevis, occupy the second compartment, deep the extensor retinaculum. This is the extensor digitorum muscle. It arises from the common extensor origin, and its four tendons pass to the medial four fingers. The extensor digiti minimi appears to be a part of the extensor digitorum muscle, and its tendon goes to the little finger. The little finger, therefore, has two tendons, one from the extensor digitorum, and the other is the tendon of the extensor digiti minimi. On the dorsum of the proximal phalanx of each finger, the extensor tendon expands to form the extensor expansion. This expansion is attached to the base of the middle and distal phalanges. This is the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle. It arises from the common extensor origin and extends along the ulna, to which it is attached by an aponeurosis, and it is inserted into the base of the fifth metacarpal. Notice that the posterior border of the ulna separates the extensor carpi ulnaris from the flexor carpi ulnaris. This is the anconeus muscle. It is the shortest muscle of the group. It arises from the lateral epicondyle and is inserted into the upper fourth of the back of the ulna. This is the extensor retinaculum. It extends across the back of the wrist and holds the tendons of the extensor muscles within the 6 compartments deep to it. This is the first compartment deep to the extensor retinaculum. It lies on the lateral side of the wrist and transmits the tendons of the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. This is the second compartment. It transmits the tendons of the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. This is the third compartment. It transmits the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus only. This is the fourth compartment. It's the widest and transmits the tendons of the extensor digitorum and extensor indices, in addition to the termination of the posterior interosseous nerve and the anterior interosseous artery after emerging on the back of the forearm. This is the fifth compartment. It transmits the tendon of the extensor digiti minimi, which is a very slender tendon. This is the sixth compartment. It transmits the tendon of the extensor carpi ulnaris. Here, the superficial group of muscles are divided and reflected to show the deeper group. This is the brachioradialis. This is the extensor carpi radialis longus. This is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. This is the extensor digitorum. This is the extensor digiti minimi. This is the extensor carpi ulnaris. Now this is the deep group of muscles. From above downwards they are the supinator, the abductor pollicis longus, the two extensors of the thumb, and the extensor indices. This is the supinator muscle. It arises from the supinator crest of the ulna and winds round the upper part of the shaft of the radius to be inserted into it. It has been seen in the cubital fossa where the posterior interosseous nerve pierces it. On the back, the nerve appears through the lower part of the muscle. It supplies all the extensor muscles of the back of the forearm except the brachioradialis and the extensor carpi radialis longus, which are supplied by the radial nerve on the lateral side of the arm, and the extensor carpi radialis brevis and supinator, which are supplied by the posterior interosseous nerve before piercing the supinator. This is the posterior interosseous artery. It appears on the back of the forearm, just medial to the nerve. Keep in mind that the artery pierces the interosseous membrane and not the supinator, so it's medial to the radius, while the nerve is lateral to it. The posterior interosseous artery is lost among the muscles and is replaced below by the termination of the anterior interosseous artery, which pierces the lower part of the interosseous membrane and runs downwards on the back of the wrist, deep to the extensor retinaculum. This is the abductor pollicis longus muscle lying edge to edge with the supinator. It arises from both the radius and ulna just below the supinator. This is the extensor pollicis brevis muscle arising from the radius. The abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis muscles descend together, and their tendons wind over the two tendons of the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. The abductor pollicis longus is inserted into the base of the metacarpal bone of the thumb, while the extensor pollicis brevis is inserted into the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. This is the extensor pollicis longus muscle. It arises from the back of the ulna, just below the abductor pollicis longus origin. Its tendon has its own compartment deep to the extensor retinaculum, where it winds around the dorsal tubercle of the radius and the thumb. It forms the medial border of the anatomical snuff box, and continues on the back of the thumb to be inserted into the base of its distal phalanx. This is the extensor indices muscle. It arises from the back of the ulna, just below the origin of the extensor pollicis longus muscle. Its tendon runs in the fourth compartment of the extensor retinaculum, together with the tendons of the extensor digitorum. It runs to the back of the index finger to join the extensor expansion, which is common to it, and a tendon from the extensor digitorum. Note that each of the thumb, the index finger, and the little finger has two extensor tendons. The thumb has the extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. The index finger has the extensor indices and a tendon from the extensor digitorum. The little finger has the extensor digiti minimi and a tendon from the extensor digitorum. All these tendons are seen clearly on the back of the hand, with the dorsal interossei filling the gaps between the metacarpal bones. There are 4 dorsal interossei. Both the palmar and the dorsal interossei put the hand in the writing position, and all are supplied by the ulnar nerve, which, if paralyzed, leads to a condition called claw hand. Paralysis of the radial nerve or its posterior interosseous branch will paralyze the extensors of the wrist, leading to wrist drop. Median nerve paralysis will lead to ape hand, where the thumb is adducted to the other fingers.
Well, this is the end of the anatomy of the upper limb. I hope that on these 2 hours, in part 1 and part 2, you had sufficient knowledge for the anatomy of the upper limb.